Hello and welcome to the installation A to Z presentation of the Siebel 22 workshop. In this presentation we are going to look at a pathway to installing Siebel CRM 22, which is also valid for previous versions such as 21, on Microsoft Windows, using techniques that are commonplace and can be alternatively also used on different operating systems. So whenever you intend to, for example, and that is the dominant example for this presentation and also for the demonstration video, when you want to learn how to install Siebel CRM, you need a machine. You need at least one machine, or of course you can install Siebel on a group of machines. And one of the benefits of cloud is definitely to quickly spin up instances with the required operating system, memory size, CPU count, and disk size. So the screenshot shows us Oracle Cloud, where we create, for example, a compute instance with Windows Server 2019 and 2 OCPUs, etc. So this information is just merely here for the starting point. Whenever you intend to install software, you need a machine where to install it. And that machine needs to be prepared. One preparation step that you will see in the demonstration is actually let's call it performance enhancement, in a way that we disable or uninstall any malware scanners such as Windows Defender, which will just slow us down. We know that there is no harm done in running the Siebel installers, so we can just disable them for the time being or uninstall them. It is, of course, very important to understand that while okay for a sandbox environment that you will never use in production, it is totally not okay to just disable any security measures without consulting your system and security administrators. The next thing your machine needs is a fully qualified domain name, so it needs to be addressable through an FQDN. That is typically done by setting the computer or host name and having the computer being a member of a domain. Again, you might consult with your administrators, and there might be, of course, a well-established pattern in your corporation for machine naming conventions. Another thing that Oracle recommends to do in the installation guide that comes with your Siebel environment is to create a Siebel Service Owner account. So a specific account that is a user on the machine or in the domain that is used to run the Siebel services, so the gateway server or Siebel server, and that user must be given permission, for example, to the Siebel File System. And it has several aspects to it. It's of course beneficial to use a specific user account because you can specify specific password rules. For example, for those users, the password must not expire, must not be forced to set on the next logon, and also must not contain spaces. And that is a set of prerequisites that can barely be met for regular administrative user accounts. On Unix or Linux, you would create a network account and make sure they match the UID and group ID. On Windows, you can create a domain or local account. Also make sure that the username and password that you use, or you use the same account across machines. On Windows, the user must be a member of the administrators group with at least the permissions to act as part of the operating system and log on as a service set in the group or local security policy. So now we have a machine, we have user accounts, but we do not have any software. So this list of software that you might want to download and install, we call auxiliary software because it is not actually any Siebel related software. You would need a browser to navigate the internet and then log into Siebel. And since Internet Explorer is not supported with modern versions of Siebel, you would like to install a modern and secure browser such as Google Chrome or Firefox. You would need a 7-zip or any archiving tool that can deal with zip archives, as you will have a lot of these zip files zipping around. You will only need a JDK, version 8 by the way, and OpenSSL if you want to create or modify keystores and truststores through scripts that you have or through command line utilities. For installing Siebel or running Siebel, neither Java nor OpenSSL is actually required, as is actually true for all of these pieces of software. A proxy server might be necessary if your network requirements or security requirements mandate that. So you might want to install a proxy in your test environment, or you already have one. A text editor is not a bad idea, like a decent one like Notepad++. And if not already available as a service in your environment, in your infrastructure, you would need, for example, Oracle Database 19c, a modern version of the Oracle database. Of course, if you already use Siebel for a long time and you use different database vendors, you are fine here. You do not need to install Oracle database. It's just in the case you want to go through a new installation and have a completely fresh Siebel database. One requirement actually is to have the Oracle or the database 32-bit client compatible with the database version. And that is a requirement for any machine that runs Siebel software, as the machine, of course, will have to provide the network connectivity to the database. Sometimes installers throw particular errors, and those errors could include the 32-bit client. So we include in this list the Microsoft Visual C++ redistributable for 2015 through 2019, which you can find on the internet, and might be a good idea to install both the 64 and 32-bit variants of this redistributable. Also make sure that you understand what software is supported with your Siebel environment, especially if you want to run Siebel in production and get support from Oracle. You have to understand that Oracle has a specific list of certifications where you can see which versions of operating systems or databases or other applications are supported to use alongside your Siebel software. And it is indeed a very important step in any real-life project or even in a sandbox where you learn and familiarize yourself with the Siebel architecture to have a decent amount of infrastructure planning. So the diagram here is just acting as a reminder that Siebel has lots of moving parts and lots of processes that listen on port numbers. So it's prudent to create a planning document or many documents where you can reach out and find the machine names, port numbers, account names, passwords, etc. So it might also be clear, talking of passwords, that this documentation must have a limitation as towards security and people who can access it. So take your time in documenting your 2B environment and take your time to understand all the moving blocks of the Siebel architecture. Of course, the Siebel Hub training can help here. Check the links in the video descriptions for other modules in the Siebel 22 workshop. So If and only if you want to have, let's say, a separate database server in your sandbox or test environment, then you need, of course, to install the database management system. In our case, we use Oracle 19c database, and after downloading the installer for Windows, the easiest way probably is to run the installer with the simplest set of options and create, including with the installer, use the options to create a non-container database, which gives you enough space to actually install a Siebel database later on. And in case you install the database management system, install that first. And after that, install the 32-bit client. The reason is simply that the path environment variable will be overwritten. And so by installing the client as the second piece of Oracle software, the binary folder of the 32-bit client will be first in the path. So whenever you type, for example, SQL+, it will use the 32-bit client and not the Oracle database management system, which is in 64-bit and would not work with Siebel software. The next preparation step that you need to be concerned about is actually creating a Keystore and optional TrustStore file, because that is required at installation time when you run the Siebel installers. JKS files are required because they need to be placed on the Tomcat servers, so you need to prepare those. And a JKS file needs to contain at minimum the private public key pair of the machine and a signed certificate for the machine, signed by, of course, a root certificate authority. And that certificate authority is probably something that is available in your network, as your corporation has its own certificate authority or pays a third party to provide these services. In the demonstration, we will see how to create a self-signed certificate by using OpenSSL and Java Key Tool to create a fake certificate authority and use it to sign a certificate. This is called a self-signed certificate. It's not secure. It's okay for sandboxes, but it's probably not okay with any production-grade systems. So the steps to achieve this, to create those Java key stores, might vary very much depending on your company security infrastructure. Having said that, at the end of this process, you need to have at least one Java key store file, which you can place on the network, and you know the password to, and it contains the correct and valid certificates for your machine or your network. On GitHub, you find two places at least where you can get inspiration how to automate the process of creating self-signed certificates, or also automate the process of working with your certificate authority in your company. Oracle Siebel, the Oracle Siebel team, has a GitHub presence where they provide us with a key generator script for Linux in the containerization repository, which is actually there to support Docker imaging. But even without Docker, you can run these commands. And the blacksheep repository mentioned in this slide has a Siebel keymaker script, which is based on the information from Oracle and is optimized for running on Microsoft Windows. So before we talk further about installing Siebel, let's do a quick reality check, as we have lots and lots of demonstrations, sandbox purposes here in a training environment, but in real life you will have to face different challenges. Actually provisioning the virtual machines would probably be, and it should actually be, automated to a high degree. So you would just literally submit a ticket to a group within your company, and they would provide you with a ready-to-use one or more instances running Microsoft Windows or other operating systems and having all the company-specific settings, environment variables, certificates, and maybe even pre-installed software like the 32-bit database client ready to use and configured. So that is, of course, an ideal scenario, and it should be the case in a professional data center. Another important part is not to miss or ignore the planning phase for your environment, as simple as it may be or as complex as it will be. The database most probably already exists, so you connect your Siebel Enterprise to an existing Siebel database, which could be either a copy or clone of an existing 22 database, which means you, for example, intend to create a test environment using a copy of another test database or production database, or you have cloned a pre-IP17 database for the purposes of upgrading it, or it is an upgraded database, so we do not really teach upgrade here in this module. There's another module for that. Please check the links in the description, and also see the description for a video link where you can find a walkthrough of a new database installation for the Siebel database. So now we're getting ready and closer to actually running the Siebel installers. So with the modular deployment engine arrived in early 2021, what you download from Oracle support is a set of zip files. Depending on the version and of the operating system, you have a different number of zip files. And the first of those zip files contains the table of contents for the other zip files. So depending on your needs, you do not need to extract all of these files, so pay attention to the documentation here. So once you have extracted the necessary zip files, you can run the installer, and please make sure to watch the demonstration video to see that in action. The modular deployment engine that we use for installing Siebel 21.2 or higher, including Siebel 22, installs everything. On the Windows variant that we see the screenshot here, and why do we know it's Windows? Because there's Siebel Tools and Siebel Web Client included. And you notice that Siebel Web Client, for example, is gray, so that it has not been extracted from the zip files. What you also see in the screenshot is that new database repository is available for selection, like ancestor database repository. So again, the relevant zip files have been extracted. And Siebel Enterprise component means any service that can run on a Siebel server machine. That includes, of course, the Siebel server itself, the gateway or cloud gateway as it's sometimes called, and the application interface. So there's no separate choice other than you define to configure the installation for enterprise container or application interface container later. If you intend to install a new Siebel database, you need also to mark the new database or master repository. And if you want to use that installation for orchestrating a Siebel upgrade, you need both the master repository and the ancestor repository selected. Depending on your settings, you will be prompted to configure application containers. So in this screenshot, we have both the enterprise and AI container. And the question here is about the port numbers to be used for the Tomcat services. So there are 3 port numbers: HTTPS or the TLS or secure port, where you will make the connections, also known as the redirect port, because the HTTP port will redirect to that port. And there's the famous Tomcat shutdown port to be specified as well. If you configure an AI, then you have to provide the primordial user account and its password. This primordial user account and password need to be stored in a safe place and be made available to anyone who then later logs into the Siebel Management Console, SMC, for the first time. The SMC will then prompt for the Bootstrap process to begin. That user is stored outside of any authentication system, so make sure it's a combination of username and password that you can retrieve later. And for both the enterprise and AI containers, the future Tomcat services, we now need to provide the place where the Keystore and Truststore files are stored. So this might be a folder in your network or your local machine. And we can use the same file for Keystore and Truststore, but in higher environments you will probably have separate files. However, only those files need to have the same password, as the installer only allows us to enter one password. So it must match both files in case they are separate files. And once the installer finishes for either enterprise components or AI, we will have a Tomcat service running on the Windows machine. So the Tomcat service is installed automatically. It will be installed with default Apache settings. So especially the initial memory pool and maximum memory pool shown in the screenshot in the Apache console is too low. So the default settings are 128 and 256 megabytes respectively, which is far too little for supporting a Tomcat alongside a Siebel installation. So here the administrator has increased it by a factor of 10, which is still a small size for example, for production environments. So it's important that your planning includes a sizing review, maybe working with Oracle, and to consider the memory consumption of the Tomcat services here alongside with the Siebel components. Time for another reality check. So if you consider that machine that we have discussed right now, the machine has the Siebel binaries installed. So it has one or more folders with Siebel homes there, and the Tomcats are installed and ready to run. But nothing has really happened with that machine, so it's not part of an enterprise or so. So that is an ideal time to take a backup of the machine or a virtual machine snapshot with the tooling of your choice. So that will allow you for very easy provisioning of Siebel machinery later on. So in case you want to have a bigger enterprise, you can just spin up additional machines using that image that you save at this point in time. The use cases include, for example, setting up an entirely new enterprise, bootstrap it, so to speak, or join an existing enterprise when you need a new Siebel server, a new AI, or a new gateway cluster node. You simply create an instance of that machine snapshot, and you have a ready-to-use machine where you simply start up the Tomcat services and then make it part of the enterprise. So now let's discuss the steps to install a new Siebel database. A new Siebel database will be rarely installed for the reason simply that in your environment, in your project, you have Siebel databases, so that we discussed beforehand. But in case you want to install a fresh Siebel database, these are the steps. So on your database, you need to create table spaces. For Oracle, for example, you need to create a normal data table space, so to speak, and an index table space where the indexes will be kept. So this is according to the Oracle Siebel documentation. Then there is a file called grant user SQL provided in the binary folders. And that grant user SQL needs to be executed, and it generates the typical Siebel standard users such as sadmin, LDAP user, guest CST, etc. And as admin in Siebel, you should also assign unlimited quota, so there are no problems when there are large operations on the database. Then you run the database configuration wizard, a tool that is provided alongside a Siebel server installation. And that configuration wizard, you define the steps to install the Siebel database. The wizard will generate a so-called upgrade configuration file. Despite being a new install, it's still called an upgrade configuration file. And that configuration file is the input for the upgrade wizard. Again, the word upgrade here might sound misleading. The upgrade wizard is used for many operations against Siebel databases, including, of course, the upgrade, the namesake, but also including new installations. So the Siebel upgrade wizard will orchestrate all the necessary steps to create the tables in those table spaces you provide, to import seed data, to import the repository, and to create other artifacts in the database that make up the Siebel database in the version you're installing. So, for example, you install 22.1. The repository that is imported is the 22.1 master repository. It might be clever to verify the license keys. So Oracle tells us that a standard installation or update to 20.5 or higher will actually activate all the license keys, but it's still, of course, an okay scenario to verify those license keys and talk to Oracle about the licensing. If your new database or if any existing database might require additional language packs other than the ENU, the English United States language, you would have to run the database configuration wizard and upgrade wizard combination to actually do two things. Two separate processes are required. The first step is to run install a repository, which actually imports the symbolic strings for the desired language, and then import the seed data for the desired language pack. There's a note on this slide that the database wizard should pick up the common master repository file to import the symbolic strings. You might want to install Siebel tools as well. Since we are talking about Windows environments, even on a Windows server where you would not usually log in to do development work, Siebel tools might be very handy, at least on one machine. For example, just to simply run command lines such as full publish. And it's really clever to install it in a separate folder and not alongside with the Siebel Enterprise components. That is simply because the folder structure will become very weird, to say the least, if you install Siebel tools or also the Siebel web client, the developer web client in that case, alongside the same folder structure as Siebel Enterprise components. So keep it separate, run the installer several times. And if you have created a new database and if you have installed a language pack, then it's actually required to run a full publish. So here we have a good use case for Siebel tools on the server to use the siebdef executable on the command line to run the full publish process for the two languages you have now in this example. So now let's go back. You either have now, if you consider this a step-by-step example, you either have now a new Siebel database without a Siebel Enterprise, or you have an existing Siebel database that you can connect to, but you still have no Siebel Enterprise. The only thing you have at this point is two Tomcat servers, one internal, one external, and the external Tomcat server, we also call the AI Tomcat, runs one application, the Siebel Management Console at this time. So the Siebel Management Console is your entry point for the post-install setup and configuration of a new enterprise, and also for deployment of components into new or existing enterprises and ongoing maintenance. We'll also use the SMC to create and deploy the migration application, the application interface, and you can also use this console for server configuration and server management tasks. But first we need an enterprise. So the first thing you see when you log into the SMC with that primordial user account that you specified at installation time is actually the prompt to register the gateway, and that is the first of 3 Bootstrap steps. So the gateway and port number need to be specified. In the second step, you will create the so-called security profile, where database authentication is probably the easiest way to continue. You will then be forced to log in again with the database credentials. And then you can continue to the third step, the registry creation. So for each of these Bootstrap steps, we have separate screenshots and discussions. So the first step is called Setup Gateway Identify Host. So this is what you see after the first login. And you have to specify 2 things, the host name and port number of the internal or SES Tomcat that must be running at this point of time. And that is going to be your new primary gateway machine for the time being. Also, you will have to specify the what Oracle calls TLS listener port. That is a bit ambiguous, as TLS is transport layer security, and actually that port number is the port that the gateway service, the service formerly known as Siebel Gateway Name Server, will use. Here are a few details what happens actually when you successfully complete this step. There's only one thing really that happens, is that the application interface.properties file on your external Tomcat will be updated with the Cloud Gateway host URI. And that will be the REST endpoint literally for the Cloud Gateway on the gateway machine. So now that the AI knows to connect to this machine, it can continue with the second step. So this is what you see after completing the first step. You will prompted to set up the gateway and create the security profile. This security profile is the profile that the gateway will use to authenticate logins. So for example, if you log into Server Manager, this is the security profile that's going to be used. So for simplicity, you will probably use database authentication basic mode as the first. You have to create a data source. You see the options on the screenshot. You can have advanced mode for database authentication, or LDAP, or custom SDK. Now, only the first one is really so simple that you probably use it at this time. You can later change or replace the security profile. Once you set this up successfully, the database authentication will be validated, and you will be forced to log out. Actually, the SMC will log you out, and you will be forced to log in. As a result of this step, the whole security profile that you entered is stored temporarily in a file called gateway.properties on the Cloud Gateway machine. It's just a temporary storage because we do not have a zookeeper right now. The third Bootstrap step actually changes that, as it creates the registry. The registry is another name that we use in Siebel for zookeeper. So it is the registry that contains the entire enterprise configuration, including the profiles you create in SMC and including the information formerly written to the eapps.cfg file on the Siebel Web Server extension, for example. So the Bootstrap Step 3 runs automatically after you re-log in with your database credentials, and you specify a port number And the port number is the port that Zookeeper will listen on for client connections, also known as the Zookeeper client port. You specify a username and password. This is going to be the account that you can use to log in to Zookeeper later on, if necessary. For example, through the Zookeeper command line. And that process instantiates the gateway registry service, the service formerly known as Siebel Gateway Name Server, or a daemon on Linux, and it instantiates the Zookeeper. So the gateway service is literally a wrapper around Zookeeper. So when you start the service, Zookeeper starts. When you stop it, Zookeeper stops. And Zookeeper will be instantiated with an empty or almost empty registry. Especially the enterprise is not yet in the registry, so there's no enterprise registered. The result of that step 3 in terms of files that you can locate on the machines, there's a BCG info file on the Cloud Gateway machine, documenting the successful bootstrap and also documenting the Zookeeper port number. And the gateway.properties file will be in its final form. Notice that in the gateway.properties file, you can also find the username and password for the registry. So now we have an empty registry, and the next logical step is to create the enterprise. First, and with many of these steps, we have to create a profile first and then use that profile to deploy the component, in that case, the enterprise. So you only can deploy one enterprise, but you can deploy more than one server, but you have to deploy at least one Siebel server, and you have to deploy at least one application interface. The SMC comes with seed profiles, so that can be used as samples for reference, and they can be easily duplicated or cloned, and then you have your own profile which you can modify. So let's start with the enterprise profile. So in the SMC, you go to Profiles, Enterprise, you clone the existing enterprise profile, the sample, and then you specify the necessary information such as the primary file system path, database connectivity, and other settings. And you save that profile. Then you go to the deployment page of SMC, you click plus, select Enterprise, and you specify the profile that you created in the previous step and deploy the enterprise using that profile. This will create, if it's a new file system, in place of the primary file system, it will create all these file system subfolders, and it will also create on the machine the so-called enterprise data source using 32-bit ODBC. Next, you need at least one Siebel server. So again, you start with cloning one of the sample profiles, creating your own profile, specifying the correct username, passwords, and the initial selection of component groups. Now, there's a lot of component groups to be selected, but don't be tempted here. This is only the initial selection. The more you select, the longer it will take for that Siebel server to actually spin up, because it will run processes for all the components within those groups. So enterprise application integration is not a bad idea because it includes the EAI object manager, which is a vital part, for example, the REST API, and also supporting the migration application because it uses REST. A small group where you can run an object manager, that will probably be your industry, and maybe web tools if it's a development environment. You can later, after deploying the server, you cannot modify the profile anymore, but you can use the traditional tools like Server Manager or the user interface options to configure and parameterize the Siebel server and its component. So you use the deployment page again to now add a Siebel server. You specify the target machine and the Tomcat port. So all the machine needs is a Siebel Enterprise Component installation with a running internal Tomcat. And then you deploy the server using the profile you generated in the previous step. Be patient here, as the Siebel server will take anything between 5 and maybe 15 or 20 minutes to start up, depending highly on the number of languages times the number of component groups you selected. If it's a new enterprise and you now have a real enterprise running a Siebel server, you can, for example, right now use the SMC. It might be a bit early, but better early than never, to synchronize batch components, which is a typical task in a fresh Siebel enterprise. You can do that later as well. And then you want to log into applications, so you need an AI. And to deploy an AI, you need a profile. The AI profile is very similar to what you put in the eapps.cfg file prior to IP17. So it has default sections and application sections, also includes the REST API parameters. So make sure you clone a sample profile and you set up your AI profile. You will be able, unlike the enterprise and Siebel server profiles, you will be able to edit the AI profile later and change the behavior of the existing AI deployments that use that profile without redeploying. The AI profile has a lot of information. So here's a page showing the basic or default information. So anything that is repeated in the application profile will be overwritten, but if it's not repeated, it will be taken from the first page. So we have active session timeout, timeout warnings, server availability, heartbeat commands, and the anonymous username and password. The application sections, especially the basic information, is important to understand that URLs in IP17 and higher have two sections at the end. The last but one is the application name, so a meaningful name to your end users for the application. And the second one is what Oracle calls the language, but let's call it a variant, because the language is really driven by the object manager parameter, not by this string. This string could designate, of course, the language, but also maybe the release or the purpose or any other piece of information. The object manager selection you do through a drop-down, which only allows you to see components that are online at the very moment. So make sure you have started your Siebel servers before. And each application has an enhanced authentication section, which looks exactly like the basic information on the first page. So here the session timeout value, for example, is required. So the value on the default page has actually no value because you have to override it on the application level or set it on the application level. Same for the timeout warning. We see that, for example, the method and command for server availability and anonymous user and password are empty. So this means that the basic information page, page 1 in the AI profile, will be used here. AI deployment happens similarly. You go to the deployment page, you click plus, choose application interface, and you specify a valid AI machine, which must host an external Tomcat. On successful deployment, you have two URLs you can use, Siebel/app for the application URLs and Siebel/v1.0. At the time of this recording, there's no other version number for the REST interface. And you can use that REST interface or that REST endpoint address to set up, for example, the migration application. Depending on your infrastructure, you might want to run the migration application on a one-to-one basis, like one per enterprise. And so you would create, for example, on a development environment, create and deploy the migration application, and create one connection pointing to your actual development enterprise. So it's the same enterprise, but there needs to be a connection. Let's look at other options. The SMC provides you in the settings page an option to remove the gateway. This basically will reset the AI and cloud gateway to a pre-Bootstrap state, including removal of the gateway registry service. On Windows, the actual Windows service will be removed. Also, the version 2 folder in Zookeeper will be removed. That means all the enterprise configuration that you have done will be lost. So it is, of course, very highly recommended to take backups of the folders or entire machines before removing the gateway. If you remove the gateway, you will notice that the gateway properties and application interface properties file on the internal and external Tomcat respectively will have undergone some changes. Some key parameters will be empty. And one other piece of software that you might want to install on your Windows client machines that you use for end users, for developers, or for running test automation, you will need to install the desktop integration Siebel agent in some use cases, such as test automation or when users require functionality supported by DISA. This is a Windows installer only, so DISA is only available for Windows at the time of this recording, and the installer will walk you through the necessary steps. It is worth mentioning here that DISA only functions well with an application user property in place. So you have to put this application user property in the repository. It is called file download save. It actually has two possible values. The value shown here is all, allowing all file extensions to be considered safe for download, but you can specify a semicolon separated list of file extensions, so only those will be deemed safe for download. If that use property is not in place, the DISA file functionality, the file system functionality, will actually not work. A good way of testing is go to any attachment view in the Siebel client and see if the inline editing functionality is available. If that is available, your DISA is in good shape. Another aspect of installing Siebel CRM is during an upgrade project, you might come across documentation or recommendations to run the so-called migration installation. Now that is a special mode of installation, and you might or might not consider it for your project. However, let's quickly review how does it work. So the MDE installer will be run in a migration use case, and there's instructions on Oracle support, which include a lot of details how to actually prepare the environment to run this. The first environment that you migrate is actually because it is only applicable to environments in an upgrade scenario, so environments prior to IP17. The first machine where you run the migrate installation of the new software contains the Siebel 16 or earlier web server extension. So it's the prior to IP17 web server. You run the migrate installation on top of the existing old Siebel software, and as a result you will have an Tomcat running, which will represent the future external Tomcat. Then you migrate the gateway machine. Again, it's a machine prior to IP17, and the migration installer will prompt you for the necessary input, to actually connect to that AI, connect to the SIEBNS file, and it will read the enterprise definition, and it will literally migrate the content of the SIEBNS file of your prior to IP17 software and enterprise to the new zookeeper. And then you can start running the migration for Siebel Server. So migration installation is a very special use case where you install a modern version of Siebel on top of an older version in an upgrade scenario. So it's actually quite complex, and you should consider contacting Oracle if you want to do this at all. Imagine the complexity here is not decreasing because you might need to manually add components such as web tools, which simply do not exist in prior Siebel versions, to get your development environment up and running, notwithstanding all the parameters that you might need to adjust. So it might be definitely worth discussing, but in the planning phase for your upgrade, you might well decide to go with a new installation rather than a migration installation. So here are some other caveats for the migration installation. So you must provide during the migration installation as admin username and password. There have been indications that if the password has special characters such as hyphens or dashes or slashes or spaces, because this password will be used in command lines a lot, those hyphens, dashes, slashes, or spaces cause a lot of troubles. The input files that are used to automate all the deployment steps in the migration must be validated. Sometimes the JSON generated is not valid. So the alternative to migration installation, as we already discussed, is a new installation. In an upgrade scenario, this means that you have to manually find a way to merge the original enterprise configuration from the SIEBNS file to the new enterprise. There is a utility called CFG merge, and various third-party comparison tools can help you identify your custom component definitions and customized parameters that are different from a vanilla enterprise setting. And then you can create, as the CFG merge utility, for example, does, it creates input files for the server manager command line to, well, put your new enterprise that you have created from scratch into the shape that you need. So in this presentation, we have taken a look at potential ways of installing Siebel CRM, focusing on the server side of things, from the machine setup, installation of the Oracle database and client, download of the Siebel software certificates, installation, Bootstrap steps, and we also discussed the migration application, DISA, and migration installation. Thanks for watching, take care, and bye-bye.